Welcome to Moonlit Romantic, where each tale is a lantern in the night, guiding you toward love's quiet corners. Tonight's story is The Clockmaker's Bride. In a village where time moves at the pace of turning gears, a solitary clockmaker finds his world altered. When a mysterious young woman steps through his shop door, her arrival will test the careful rhythm of his days and teach him that the heart keeps its own clock, one that doesn't always follow the hands he can control. So settle into the stillness, let the hours slip away, and let the story begin. Chapter 1. The Journal in the Study. London in the month of March wore its mist like a shroud. The air was cool and damp, curling around the corners of buildings and slipping under doorways as if the fog itself carried whispers. Fleet Street bustled faintly beyond the Vale. Carriages creaked over slick cobblestones, and boot heels clicked in hurried measure. But here, in the Whitcomb residence on Devonshire Terrace, the world was still. Eliza Whitcomb sat at the great oak desk in her late father's study, a single lamp casting a soft circle of light across scattered papers. Dust drifted lazily in the air, disturbed only when she reached for another bundle of documents from the stack beside her. It had been only 6 weeks since the funeral. 6 weeks since she had stood in black silk, with her gloved hands clasped, hearing the vicar speak of her father as a man of letters, a man of learning, a man whose mind never ceased its work. All of that was true, but it was also incomplete. Her father, Dr. Edmund Whitcomb, had indeed been a scholar, well regarded in circles that discussed ancient languages and mechanical curiosities, but he had also been a man who loved mysteries. Even in life, his study had felt like a labyrinth of secrets, with its heavy bookcases and locked drawers. Eliza had been permitted here only on occasion, and only when he was present. Now, as the sole heir, she was tasked with sorting his affairs. It was a task she had approached with diligence at first. The solicitor had told her plainly, papers relating to finances must be gathered, personal effects sorted, manuscripts and research sent to the university if she did not wish to keep them. Yet the more she worked, the more she discovered stray things that drew her into the past rather than propelling her into the future. That morning, while dusting the back shelves, her hand had brushed against a volume that was not quite aligned with the others. It was no book at all, but a leather-bound journal, worn soft at the edges, its cover stained in places with what might have been ink or oil. The latch was unfastened. She hesitated only a moment before opening it. The first pages were filled with precise sketches, delicate renderings of gears, cogs, escapements, and springs. Not the idle doodles of a gentleman at leisure, but technical drawings marked with measurements and notes in her father's hand. Interspersed between the sketches were fragments of prose, sometimes only a few words, sometimes entire paragraphs. One name appeared again and again, Nathaniel Harcourt. Beneath it, in smaller script, Master Clockmaker, Fleet Street. Eliza frowned. She had never heard the name. Her father's acquaintances were a parade of academics, collectors, and the occasional eccentric patron of the sciences, A clockmaker seemed unusual. She turned another page and found a line that made her pulse quicken. The design cannot be completed without Harcourt's precision. Arrangement must be honored. Arrangement? She read on. There were hints of an agreement, something between her father and this Nathaniel, though the language was frustratingly vague. The sketches grew more elaborate toward the journal's end. She lingered over one in particular. A sphere of interlocking brass rings, delicate as jewelry, but complex as a star chart. Tiny etchings along the arcs suggested astronomical symbols. Beneath it, in her father's tidy hand, completion will change everything. Eliza leaned back, the lamplight casting shadows over her pale features. The room smelled of leather and old paper, the scent of her father's life. She closed the journal slowly, fingers still resting on the cover. That afternoon, Eliza took tea alone in the drawing room, her mind turning the discovery over and over. The arrangement, the clockmaker, the invention. By the time she set down her cup, her decision was made. She would go to Fleet Street. The fog was thicker by the time she hailed a hansom cab. It clung to the driver's coat and softened the glow of gas lamps, turning each into a floating halo. As the carriage rattled eastward, Eliza pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders and tried to imagine the man she was about to meet. A master clockmaker. She pictured an older gentleman with silver hair and spectacles, perhaps bent over his workbench in a dim shop crowded with timepieces. The sort of man who would call her my dear and reminisce about her father's brilliance. The cab turned onto Fleet Street and slowed before a narrow storefront between a print shop and a tobacconist. A gilded sign above the door read, Harcourt and Company, Horologists. Eliza stepped down onto the pavement. The shop windows were filled with clocks of every description. Mantel clocks with ornate cases, long case clocks with moon-phase dials, carriage clocks gleaming under the light. Their hands all marked different hours, yet they ticked in a strange, harmonious chorus. When she pushed open the door, a bell chimed overhead. The scent of oil and polished wood wrapped around her. Behind the counter, a tall man straightened from a workbench. He was not much older than herself, perhaps in his mid-20s, with dark hair swept neatly back and eyes the color of polished slate. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the forearm, revealing lean, capable hands, smudged faintly with graphite. For a moment, they simply regarded each other. Then he said, his voice low and precise, "Miss Whitcomb, I presume?" Eliza blinked. "You know my name?" "Your father spoke of you," he replied. "You knew him then?" A pause. "I did." She stepped closer to the counter, studying him. "And you are Nathaniel Harcourt?" "I am." His gaze flickered, just briefly, toward the leather satchel she carried. "Have you brought it?" Her heart gave a small leap. Brought what? Instead of answering, he reached beneath the counter and produced a folded sheet of parchment, yellowed with age. He set it before her and smoothed it open. Eliza leaned over to read. It was a formal document, written in an elegant hand. an agreement between Dr. Edmund Whitcomb and Mr. Charles Harcourt to be entered into by their heirs, Eliza Margaret Whitcomb and Nathaniel James Harcourt, in the event of their attaining suitable age. Her gaze lifted sharply. "This is an engagement contract," Nathaniel said evenly. Eliza stared at him. "This is absurd, antiquated. I never—" "Nor did I," he interrupted, his tone still measured. "But our fathers saw fit to bind us to it, and your father, Miss Whitcomb, wished it honored." She shook her head, drawing herself up. "I have no intention of being bound by an arrangement made before I was born." His eyes held hers. "Then perhaps we should speak of the other matter." "What other matter?" Nathaniel glanced toward the satchel again. "The journal." Eliza's fingers tightened on the strap. "Your father entrusted me with part of the design years ago," Nathaniel continued. "Without the rest, it is incomplete. And without me, Miss Whitcomb, you will never understand its purpose." Eliza's pulse quickened despite herself. "And why should I care for its purpose?" "Because," he said softly, "it is what your father devoted his final years to. And because, whether you wish it or not, our fates are already entwined." Eliza left the shop with the fog curling cold around her cheeks, the journal heavy in her satchel, and a dozen questions weighing heavier still. Nathaniel Harcourt was nothing like she had imagined, and she had the uneasy sense that the ticking of his clocks was not the only mechanism now set in motion. Chapter 2. The Master of Fleet Street. The fog thickened toward evening, draping Fleet Street in veils of pearl and ash. Gaslights glowed like patient stars, suspended just above the pavement, as if heaven had tilted and spilled a handful of constellations into London's thoroughfares. Eliza Whitcomb stood a moment beneath one of those lanterns, her gloved hands folded on the handle of her satchel, and let the drizzle purl along the rim of her bonnet. She told herself she would not return to Harcourt and Company. Not today. Perhaps not at all. She lasted precisely the length of a single heartbeat. In truth, she had fled his shop with the sensation of a door swung open inside her. A draft of cold air, a smell of oil and brass and time. The document he had shown her trembled in the chamber of her thoughts. It felt antiquated, preposterous, and yet the ink was undeniably her father's, the seal undeniably his. She could deny Nathaniel Harcourt. She could deny the arrangement. But she could not deny the journal in her satchel, or the pulse it had awoken in her hands. Eliza turned back. The bell over the door chimed again, softer this time, and that braided chorus of ticks and tocks welcomed her with the unfailing courtesy of machines that only ever told the truth. Nathaniel looked up at once, as though he had expected precisely this capitulation, and had arranged his posture to greet it. The sleeves of his shirt were still rolled to the forearm. A length of fine screw thread gleamed between his fingers, and beside him, the jeweler's loop shone like a single drop of midnight. "You came back," he said, and though his voice held the even shape of a man accustomed to exactness, Eliza detected a filament of relief running through it. Briefly, she replied, I do not intend to be detained by contracts forged against my consent. Noted, he said, with the ghost of a bow. And yet here you are. Eliza removed her gloves with an air of deliberation she hoped would disguise the irregular rhythm of her pulse. If we are to speak, Mr. Harcourt, then let us speak plainly. You claim that without you, I will never divine the purpose of my father's designs. I claim that without the journal, you cannot complete whatever it is you intend to build. Shall we test our hypotheses in good faith? His gaze touched the satchel. Would you trust me with it? Number. But I shall trust you with a page. Nathaniel set the screw thread down, wiped his hands with a square of linen, and gestured toward a tall-backed stool beside the counter. I shall accept a page, and in exchange, I shall offer you something of mine. Your candor, perhaps? My workshop, he said simply. There are declarations that make a racket of themselves, and there are declarations that slip into a room and quietly change everything that can be seen. Eliza understood at once that she had been invited into the sanctuary of his craft. It was not candor precisely, but it was a manner of confession. She unbuckled the satchel. The smell of old leather and graphite lifted like breath from a sleeper, and her father's journal lay bare to the lamplight. She opened to a page halfway through, one of the more intricate sketches, whose delicate bands and fused tiny teeth had insinuated themselves into her mind. She tore out the thick leaf with care and slid it across the counter. Nathaniel did not touch it at once. He looked the way a physician looks at a fevered child, a study made of attention and restraint. Then he lifted the page by its edges and held it near the lamp. The shadow of the sketch was thrown upon the wall, huge and tender, and the drawn gears turned in Eliza's imagination as if the lamplight itself could animate them. An orrery of sorts, he murmured, and yet not. The ratios are not celestial, not precisely. Dr. Whitcomb has disguised them. Disguised them from whom? From any eye, but the eye he expected. Nathaniel lowered the page. From mine. Eliza could not help the flare of indignation and the answering ache of curiosity. Then you did collude. You and he conspired together, behind my back and before my birth. Your father, Nathaniel said, with care, did not consider you a party to a scientific quarrel that predated both of us. He and my father were friends and rivals, two facts that in London's clockwork neighborhoods frequently share a single heartbeat. Have you ever watched an escapement arrest the ambition of a spring, only to release it a heartbeat later? Friendship and rivalry are such a pair. I am acquainted with principle, Eliza answered. I dispute the practice. Good, dispute it, he said, surprising her with an earnestness that warmed the shop's chill. Dispute every inch of ground you stand upon, Miss Whitcomb, if the standing will be yours. But do not turn from a mechanism simply because its beauty was hidden. He gestured toward a narrow door behind the counter. Come. If I am to speak plainly, it is best that you hear me in the place where I am truest. Eliza followed him. The workshop beyond was narrower than she had imagined, and twice as tall, ribbed with shelves and lit by a series of oil lamps, whose flames steadied in glass chimneys. Workbenches ran along the walls, each with its own constellation of tools. The air smelled of whale oil, metal filings, charcoal, and the faint lemon of a polished cloth left to dry on a hook. On one bench lay a set of balance wheels that winked like golden coins. On another, a row of blued screws, laid out like a miniature regiment. Near the far wall, a long case clock slept with its hood open, the polished brass of its movement gleaming like a heart laid bare. Nathaniel paused there and lifted the torn page beside the exposed movement, as though introducing kindred spirits. The difference between a gentleman's fancy and a clock is not merely that a clock tells time, he said. It is that a clock answers to it. Your father's designs do not answer time as other things do. They defy it? Eliza asked, unable to keep skepticism from her voice. They anticipate it, Nathaniel said softly, or measure what is commonly left unmeasured. He set the page down and turned the clock's great driving wheel with deft fingers. The pallets nodded, the escape wheel clicked, and the familiar conversation of tick and tock resumed, a sound that is really a pair of sounds, desire and denial taking turns. Eliza watched the pendulum's slow, solemn bow, watched the polished bob pass through its lowest point again and again with monastic fidelity. My father had an ear for Latin and a fondness for metaphors, she said, half to herself. But metaphors are not machines. Then you are safe with me, Nathaniel replied, for I am poor with metaphors and excellent with steel. Eliza almost smiled. It was not romance your father's bound, he continued after a moment, though they would have been content, I think, had affection grown from it. It was safety they bound, the kind of safety that can be made from secrecy when power is at stake. Eliza thought of the line she had read, completion will change everything, and of the way her father had gone quiet in his final year, as if his sentences required more air than his lungs could supply. What power! Not the sort that marches with sabers, Nathaniel said. The sort that sits behind a ledger and dictates the price of bread. She felt a faint chill that did not come from the weather. Bankers? And their cousins, he said. Industrialists, investors, in rail and cable. Men who have learned to turn minutes into gold and would pay handsomely to buy more minutes than belong to them. Eliza found a stool and sat. You speak as though time were a commodity you could fold and apportion, like linen on a shelf. Have you never noticed, Nathaniel asked, how some rooms lengthen an hour and some rooms break it to pieces? How grief carries a day in an instant, and joy carries an instant for a day. Men like the ones I have named wish to perform such compressions on command. Your father, I think, wished to prove that time's temperament might be observed and perhaps influenced, but in defense of the weak, not for the luxury of the strong. Eliza's mouth had parted without her noticing. Influenced? You speak like an alchemist. I speak like a mechanic who has listened to too many clocks. Nathaniel tapped the page. Look again at his ratios. He drew a stool beside hers, and together they bent their heads over the torn sheet. He showed her how the teeth counts were not typical for an orrery, how the gearing would not simply represent the heavens, but convert motion into an elegantly varying beat. He sketched on scrap, his pencil moving with the clean certainty of a man who had long ago argued a proposition into habit. He did not graze her hand, yet Eliza felt the nearness of him all the same, the careful breath, the disciplined quiet. It reminded her of standing at the edge of a river at night, soundless on the surface, powerful beneath. "My father wrote of you," Eliza said, at length, because the silence had grown companionable, and therefore bold. "Not your Christian name, but the surname often enough. He called you precise. He called you watchful." A flicker crossed Nathaniel's features, as brief as a sparrow's passage. He was a generous man with his adjectives. "Not always," she countered. Nathaniel's mouth tilted. "Then perhaps those two may be trusted." Eliza hesitated. "And my father, how did you describe him to yours?" "As a scholar who knew when sums were wrong," Nathaniel said. He set the pencil down, its point still sharp, as if refusing the notion of dullness, and as a man who did not mistake noise for music. The clock on the far wall struck the hour, its voice low and round like a choir boy with a secret. Other clocks answered, a polite cacophony. The shop front remained a dimly lit stage beyond the door. Here, in the workshop, the air was thicker, pressed with purpose. Eliza could feel a decision gathering around them, dropping its weight grain by grain as sand does in a glass. "Very well," she said, the words arriving with a clarity that startled her. "I will not surrender the journal, but I shall work with you. I shall copy pages and bring them in order. We will assemble the device, if device it is, and we will do so exactly as my father intended, without the knowledge of men whose ledgers eclipse their consciences. In exchange, you will speak plainly to me of every discovery we make. You will not hide anything behind a tradesman's mystery or a gentleman's vow. And as to the other contract," she drew breath, "you will not presume upon it." Nathaniel's expression did not change, but his shoulders eased in a way that told her he had been braced against something. "All of that is acceptable," he said, "on a single condition of my own." Eliza lifted her chin. "Name it." "That you cease to consider yourself a messenger of a dead man's will and instead consider yourself my colleague." His eyes were steady, almost stern with earnestness. A colleague listens. A colleague argues. A colleague understands when the work must come before pride, and when pride must protect the work. Eliza found that she had not breathed, and so she breathed. Agreed. Nathaniel rose. "Then the first problem is tolerances. Brass is faithful and brass is false, both at once. It keeps the measure it is taught, but it learns the temperature of a room too readily. Your father's gearing asks that we hold the beat steady while allowing the beat to bend. That is the paradox." "It sounds like courtesy," Eliza said, before she could forbid the thought, and then was embarrassed by it. Nathaniel's smile flashed and was gone. Courtesy is an engineering of a sort. He crossed to a high shelf and took down a small wooden case, which he opened to reveal an assortment of jewels, tiny donuts of ruby, emerald, and sapphire, each drilled through with a pin-sized hole. A stone does not warp as brass does. It bears friction lightly and improves the temper of steel. Jewel bearings, Miss Whitcomb. How very extravagant, Eliza murmured, enchanted despite herself by the neat color of them. How very necessary, Nathaniel corrected. Economy is a poor virtue in a place where precision is the only morality. He set a sliver of ruby into a plate with tweezers and held it to the lamp. Flame and stone exchanged a glint. Eliza leaned closer, and then a sound from the shop front startled them both, the bell chiming twice in quick succession, followed by the unmistakable rasp of a boot that had learned to swagger. Nathaniel's mouth thinned. He closed the case of jewels with care, set it aside, and wiped his hands again. I must ask you to remain here, he said quietly, and to say nothing. Are we besieged by ledgers? Eliza whispered, not as certain as she wished that she was making a jest. By their heralds, he said, and stepped through the door. Eliza gathered the torn page into her lap and sat very still. Voices rose and fell beyond the counter. One, Nathaniel's, restrained and precise. The other, a heavier instrument, cultivated to sound generous, but stuffed with calculation. She could not make out the words, only their shapes. Money flattened and expanded, timeline, procurement, exclusivity, the sort of syllables one hears in clubrooms and avoids if one is wise or small. At length the bell chimed again. The door closed. Silence pooled like clear water. Nathaniel returned. He did not speak at once. He set about tidying the bench with an exactness too meticulous to be merely neat. Only when the tools lay in their accustomed places did he straighten and meet Eliza's gaze. You will say I am melodramatic, he said, and perhaps I am. But there are men who would purchase this work for the price of 100 lives measured in bread, and there are men who would steal it for less. And which was our visitor? Eliza asked softly. The sort who smiles while he steals. She folded her hands to keep them from betraying her. How did he learn to come? The same way drafts learn where a house is weakest, Nathaniel said, by habit and by rumor. Your father's circle was not so tight as he hoped. Eliza felt the first true pang of fear, a small bell in the chest, too honest to be ignored. Then perhaps it is folly to remain. And perhaps it is folly to yield, Nathaniel said. Your father believed that the right hands can make a dangerous instrument safe by virtue of intention and design. I am too much a mechanic to believe in virtue without design. And I, Eliza said to her own surprise, am too much his daughter to believe in design without virtue. They stood looking at one another, two citizens of neighboring countries, separated by a border that was also a bridge. Eliza felt again the sense of a door opening, not the cold draft this time, but a warmer tide, the knowledge that her life had begun to veer from its previous path, even if only by a fraction of a degree. A fraction is enough, she thought. Given distance and time, a fraction becomes a horizon. Very well, Nathaniel said at last. If you will return tomorrow with 3 pages, no more, we must not outrun our own caution. I shall, in the meantime, fashion a mock-up that will accept your father's gearing. We will begin with a train that can teach us how the beat bends. 3 pages, Eliza repeated. And you will make, what did you call it? A mock-up, he said, with a craftsman's modesty. A cradle for a theory. It will be ugly. It will be honest. Then I shall bring 3 pages and a measure of faith, Eliza said, allowing herself the briefest inclination of a smile. A fair exchange, he said, and did not disguise the answering smile of his own. Eliza donned her gloves and gathered her satchel. As she did, her gaze at last took notice of a small object on a narrow shelf near the door, a pocket watch whose silver case was undecorated, except for a single engraved initial, an E, curled like a fern. She reached toward it. Nathaniel spoke quickly. Do not wind that one. Eliza withdrew her hand at once. Why not? Because I have failed it, and it remembers, he said, with a rueful softness. It belonged to a man who asked me for time I could not give. The workshop seemed to draw the lamps closer. Eliza inclined her head, accepting the answer as one accepts the sign on a gate that reads, Beware of garden. I shall not disturb it. Thank you. They returned to the shop front. He opened the door for her, and the fog wrote its syllables across the threshold. The street had settled into that hour when the city turns its face inward and pulls its shawl close. A vendor called somewhere down the way. A hansom clattered across a rut and swore in iron. Eliza stepped out and paused. Mr. Harcourt, she said. Yes, Miss Whitcomb. The arrangement between our families has been named. It is a word in this room. But I mean to name something else as well. I mean to name that I am not merely my father's heir. I am my father's student. Whatever we discover will be decided by my mind as much as by his memory. Nathaniel's hand tightened very slightly upon the door's edge. That is precisely what I hoped you would say. She wanted, absurdly, to say something light. Instead, she said something true. I do not know whether I am brave or stubborn. In practice, Nathaniel said, there is less difference than theory suggests. The corner of her mouth tugged upward. Good evening, Mr. Harcourt. Until tomorrow, Miss Whitcomb. Eliza descended to the pavement, and the fog took her in as it takes in a letter by slow degrees, first the corners, then the words. The clocks behind her resumed their singular conversation. She did not look back until she reached the end of the window, when she permitted herself one glance to see if he watched her go. He did not. He had already turned to trim a lamp. She found this oddly reassuring. At Devonshire Terrace, the house had put on its nighttime silences, which are different from daytime silences, both in timbre and in intention. Eliza dismissed the maid and supped lightly in the small breakfast room, where loneliness is not so grand as in a dining room, and therefore less likely to grow proud. Then she carried the journal to the study and laid it upon the desk with the care one gives to a sleeping creature one loves. 3 pages. She would choose them not by whim but by sequence. The first to establish the train of wheels, the second to reveal the governor, the third to hint at the device that stood at the heart of the design. She thought of Nathaniel's hands, steady as a pulse, and of the jewel bearings that seemed to her like prayers drilled into stone. Outside, the fog softened the lamps on the terrace, until each had the aspect of a thought barely remembered upon waking. Eliza unstoppered her inkwell, drew a line upon a sheet to test the quill, and bent her head. She copied her father's script with painstaking exactness, not trusting herself to paraphrase. She measured, counted, drew, paused. She had never in her life been so acutely aware of the width of a pen stroke. At intervals she looked up, as if the room might have shifted around her while she worked. The portrait of her father watched from above the mantel, his scholar's eyes patient, his scholar's mouth tight, with the modesty that is a cousin to secrecy. When the third page was done, she sat back and let her hands rest upon either side of the journal. The lamplight turned her skin the color of old ivory. A quiet pride rose in her, not the bright firework of accomplishment, but a steadier, hearth-like warmth. She had not run. She had not surrendered the book. She was not merely the object of a contract, inked by men who believed that time could be harnessed with a flourish of their signature. She was the subject of her own sentence. Eliza closed the journal. Its leather sighed. She returned it to the drawer and locked it. She tied the copies in a ribbon, then untied them again, because the knot did not please her, then tied them once more. She laughed softly at herself and felt a little better. Before sleep, she opened the window and let the city's breath into the room. The fog leaned on the sill like an old cousin, familiar without invitation. Somewhere, far away, bells counted the hour. She did not number them. She only listened to the way they folded one into another, and how the interval between each was both a space and a bridge. "Tomorrow," she said quietly to the air. 3 pages. A cradle for a theory. Her heart answered with a small consent. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a thinner gray and the mild impatience of drizzle. Eliza, dressed in a walking gown of plum wool, and chose a bonnet whose ribbon would not complain in the damp. She breakfasted quickly, left a note for the maid, and set out with the copies, tucked safe in the inner pocket of her cloak. On Fleet Street, the day had opened its shop doors like eyes. Harcourt and Company gleamed faintly through its panes, and the bell danced above her head when she entered. Nathaniel emerged at once from the workshop, his shirt sleeves neat again, his collar buttoned. Only the persistent ink shadow at his fingers betrayed that he had been awake before dawn. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she returned, and produced the packet. 3 pages. He accepted them with a seriousness that felt like respect and not like solemnity. "And I," he said, with the smallest lift of a brow, "have made a thing that is ugly and honest." Eliza felt an undeserved delight on his behalf. "May I see it?" "You must." He led her into the workshop, where upon the center bench a contrivance awaited them. A frame of plain wood, planed smooth but undecorated, posts of steel rising from its corners, a plate upon which a modest train had been laid. There were gaps where more would be grafted, and dangling wires, like thoughts unfinished. It was, as promised, inelegant to the eye. It was beautiful. Nathaniel set the packet beside it and touched the frame as one touches a child's shoulder to reassure the child that reassurance is possible. We will learn upon it, he said. We will make our mistakes where they can be seen and mended. Eliza stepped closer. And then, he said, if what your father imagined proves to be what he intended, we will build the instrument that can hold such truth. He did not say what the truth would cost. He did not need to. Cost hung in the room like a clock weight, sensible, even when unseen. Miss Whitcomb, he said, opening the packet with care. Shall we begin? Yes, Eliza answered. And of all the yeses that had ever been asked of her, this one felt the least like a demand and the most like a door. Chapter 3, Secrets in Brass and Ink. The rain did not fall so much as arrange itself upon London, beating on eaves and gloving the cobblestones with a dark sheen. Fleet Street spoke in a lower register on such mornings. Printers set type with less clatter, and the cry of newsboys softened as if the damp had put a finger to every mouth. The bell at Harcourt and Cowing chimed when Eliza entered, and the chorus of clocks greeted her with that watchful courtesy she had already begun to love. Nathaniel had the look of a man who had coaxed the dawn to sit a little closer. The sleeves of his shirt were neatly rolled again, his collar fastened, his hair brushed back, yet a smudge of charcoal along his thumb gave him away, as did the gleam in his eyes that suggested a problem had surrendered some small portion of its pride to him. "Good morning," he said, and the words held the restrained pleasure of a craftsman asking the day to take its seat. "Good morning," Eliza returned. She unbuttoned her cloak and shook the rain from her bonnet's ribbon. "Has your ugly and honest contrivance learned any new manners?" "It has learned to beg for them," Nathaniel replied, and his mouth tipped toward a smile. "Come and see." In the workshop, the mock-up sat as they had left it, plain wood planed to humility, posts of steel rising from the corners, like 4 careful thoughts, a plate upon which the first small congregation of wheels and pinions waited. But now a slender pendulum hung from a temporary bracket, its bob a polished coin of brass, its rod a dark reed of steel. Beside it lay Eliza's copied pages, weighted with a stone, the size and color of a plum. "We begin," Nathaniel said, "by giving it a heartbeat." He set his fingertip to the bob and drew it aside. The pendulum swung, and the pallets began their alternating kiss with the escape wheel. Tick-tock, tick-tock. That sound is 2 sounds, Eliza thought again. Desire and denial taking turns. Patience written out as permission. Your father's ratios, Nathaniel went on, suggest an indulgence and a correction, alternating with an interval whose length answers to another motion altogether. See here. He pointed to a small wheel, mounted askew on a pivot, joined to a spring whose spiral had been blued with heat, until it wore the dignified color of a twilight sky. If we drive this with a train that is itself governed by the pendulum, we invite the beat to listen to itself. "Is that not what all clocks do?" Eliza asked. "Most clocks insist," he said. "Your father proposes that one might persuade." The distinction rang in her like a small bell struck by a thoughtful hand. They worked side by side, the way people kneel beside the same stream, cupping careful water in their palms to learn if it runs sweet. Nathaniel explained. Eliza asked, Sometimes their voices overlapped, not with impatience, but with a shared eagerness to catch the thought before it slipped back into the current. She copied figures as he spoke, and when a symbol in her father's hand grew ambiguous, Nathaniel considered it as a musician considers a grace note. How it might lean, how it might resolve, until the meaning came right. When the morning grew hungry, Nathaniel fetched 2 modest buns from a paper sack near the door, a baker's kindness from the shop at the corner, and set one upon a clean square of linen for Eliza. "You keep a mathematician's hours," she said, accepting it, and a nurse's sense of when a patient requires a spoonful of sugar. "Clocks are gluttons for attention," he replied, biting neatly into his own. "If I do not feed them my patience, they steal my pride." She smiled, then flattened the next page and set a paperweight upon it, and their small industry resumed. By late morning, the rain lightened to a mist that made the workshop lamps seem braver. Nathaniel peered into the jeweler's loop to seat another jewel, and the quiet between them acquired that human warmth which sometimes arrives only after 2 people have said the most difficult simple thing, "Shall we begin?" Eliza's own hands, which had been steady all her life at every pianoforte and sewing frame, learned new steadiness in the service of screws so tiny they looked like punctuations plucked from a page. "Hold there," Nathaniel murmured, and Eliza steadied a plate with her fingertip, while he tightened a bridge. He did not graze her. He neither flinched nor presumed, yet the nearness of him produced in her the curious sensation of standing in sunlight, while also feeling the room's cool air. 2 truths, simultaneous, and politely untroubled by the other's existence. When at last the new wheel was in place, Nathaniel stepped back with a satisfaction so contained it could have been mistaken for neutrality. "Let us see whether your father's indulgence can be persuaded to walk a straight mile," he said gently, and set the pendulum swaying once more. Tick-tock, the sound settled. Nathaniel turned a tiny corkscrew to increase the impulse. The beat widened, then returned like a pupil narrowing in brightness. Eliza closed her eyes to listen. She thought absurdly of church, how the best choirs were those that seemed to make a collective decision to breathe at the same instant. After a minute, he nodded. "It listens," he said. "Not well yet, but it listens." He reached for Eliza's page. "If I am right, the next portion wants a governor that is neither fan nor fly, but something subtler." A noise from the shop front interrupted him. The bell, a lone chime, and then a woman's voice, low, velvet, familiar to those who read the fashionable papers, for it had been quoted often. "Mr. Harcourt, how fortunate to find you in." Nathaniel's glance flicked to Eliza. He closed the lid upon the jewel case and lowered the mock-up's lamps until the shadows smoothed its angles. "Remain here," he said softly. "It is better if she does not know of you, for the moment." "Who is she?" Eliza whispered, though her heart had already supplied a name gathered from society pages and charitable announcements. Mrs. Aurelia Voss, patroness of modern manufacturers, benefactor of libraries, alleged friend to the poor, and certain friend to her own influence. Nathaniel did not answer. He stepped into the shop. Eliza kept her place beside the bench, the bowed door a proscenium through which the thinner light of the front room fell. The voices were clear where she stood, made clearer by the hush of rain easing against the windows. "My watch is ill," Aurelia Voss announced with that well-bred resignation that makes a complaint sound like philanthropy. "It hurries at night and lingers at noon. You must scold it for me. I shall educate it instead," Nathaniel said so gently that Eliza nearly laughed. "May I?" A pause, the whisper of a chain slipping free, a click. "You have been very much discussed, Mr. Harcourt," Aurelia went on. "All excellence is fashionable, of course, but yours holds a particular charm for the investor who admires a gentleman's restraint. You never publish, you never boast. One wonders if you are too modest to be quite prudent." "Prudence," Nathaniel said, "is sometimes a way of keeping one's promises." "How dear," Aurelia murmured. "To whom have you promised silence?" "To the living," he said, "and to the dead." Eliza pressed her palm against the edge of the table to steady its slight tremble. She could see Aurelia Voss in the theater of her mind, the sable at her shoulders, the quizzical mouth that made compliments sound like tests. She was older than Eliza by a decade or two, widowed, rich enough to melt the reluctance of most London doors, and keen as a tailor's shears where profit went. "You will forgive a woman's curiosity," Aurelia continued, "which is what women with power say when they intend to spend it. I hear so many charming rumors, a device that corrects the human day, a sympathy between machines that makes labor easier, a little gold box that convinces time to tolerate mistakes." "A watch," Nathaniel said, "will tolerate the mistakes its maker asks of it, provided the maker pays for them in another coin." "How like a sermon," Aurelia answered, smiling in her voice. "Do not fear, Mr. Harcourt. I am here as a client, a prospective client. If you would be tempted by a commission, something elegant for my nephew, who manages a factory in Spitalfields, I would be most grateful. A small advance, a generous balance upon delivery, and of course, the comfort of knowing your talents serve work that cannot help but better the world." There was a pause. Eliza pictured Nathaniel turning the watch over, his thumb learning the fault behind the face. When he spoke, his voice held neither eagerness nor refusal, only the patience of a man stacking facts like coins so he may count them twice. "You are kind," he said. "I must decline." "Decline?" Aurelia's laugh chimed brightly and then dropped a note. "Forgive me. Decline what?" "The commission," Nathaniel said. "Your nephew should have a watch that carries his hours obediently. I shall mend your own at once, but the other work of which you have heard is not for purchase." Silence, like a shawl gathered at a throat. "Not for purchase," Aurelia repeated, tasting the phrase as if it were an exotic fruit and discovering it to be unripe. How quaint, how stern, how very inconvenient. "Madam," Nathaniel said gently, "inconvenience is sometimes the most reliable safeguard." Another silence. Eliza imagined a smile that had teeth. "Do reconsider," Aurelia murmured. Men of science often mistake stubbornness for sanctity. Sanctity is more expensive than it looks. There is always a ledger somewhere, even in heaven. The bell rang again. Farewell, not arrival. Nathaniel remained in the front room a few breaths longer, then returned, his composure as neat as his collar. She suspects, Eliza said softly. She knows enough to be dangerous, and little enough to be patient, Nathaniel replied. It will not be the last time she asks. He set the shudder of his expression aside, and added with candor, I have mended her watches since before I could shave. She has long believed my mind would wash clean in her patronage if she poured gold over it. Eliza felt the old Whitcomb indignation rise, a flame trimmed, not snuffed by grief. It is an odd habit of certain benefactors to call theft by the name of encouragement. Nathaniel's glance warmed. You sound like your father. Then I sound as I ought, she said, and the answer steadied her. They returned to work. In the small hours of afternoon, their progress took a gentle stride. The mock-up's pendulum listened more closely. The little governor yielded and corrected with growing grace. The beat altered itself as if it had learned the difference between stubbornness and fidelity. At one point, when a wheel refused to marry a pinion without complaint, Nathaniel stepped back and rolled his shoulders with uncharacteristic frustration. I have asked it to sing in a key it was not cut for, he said. Forgive me. Then ask in another key, Eliza answered. Do not insist. Persuade. He looked at her, not as a man looks at a novelty that happens to be clever, but as one looks at a partner who has returned the logic he offered in the morning with interest. Very well, he said. Another key. They found it together. The wheel accepted the new invitation. The complaint faded. The mock-up smiled in brass. Late in the day, when the lamplight gilded the edges of everything, and the shop front had gone quiet enough that the city might have been a painting hung in a dim corridor, Eliza lifted her head and started. What is it? Nathaniel asked. She touched the ribbon that bound her copied pages. I remember this sketch, she said slowly, but I did not remember this notation. Look. He bent beside her, close enough that she could see the delicate lashes on the lid of his eye, the small, pale half-moon scar near his temple that a mother might have kissed 100 times in childhood. She directed his gaze to the margin where her father had written a line in Latin, and then beneath it, in a smaller hand, as if ashamed of showing his work, another in Greek. Nathaniel read, and his breath changed almost imperceptibly. What does it say? Eliza asked, for although her father had tried to lace those languages into her childhood, grief had turned them into knots she could not always untangle quickly. Give the poor man's hour back to him, Nathaniel translated. Then, with his thumb resting above the Greek, and here, let the overseer's clock be proven false by the worker's pulse. Eliza's vision blurred and cleared as if the day had been glass that someone wiped with a sleeve. He meant factory time, she whispered. He meant the manner in which a bell steals minutes at either end of a shift and calls it discipline. He meant the way a foreman's watch can make children older or younger, according to how prophet prefers to see them. Nathaniel nodded once. Your father's instrument, if we can make it hold its temper, would demonstrate a mood in time that cannot be falsified by the pocket it rides in, a standard that answers the body as well as the sun. Eliza sat back, the bench steady beneath her hands. In an instant, the purpose she had suspected gathered itself into form. This was not a gentleman's toy. It was not a collector's conversation. It was, if built and proven, before it could be bought and buried, an argument that might stand up in courtrooms and union halls, and on cold mornings at factory gates. "It is dangerous," she said, "and therefore necessary." "Both," Nathaniel agreed. They looked at each other without disguise. The arrangement that had hung in the air, like old lace, no longer felt like the largest thing between them. More substantial than that was the work, the peril, and the austere gladness that attends a worthy task. Something in Eliza's chest unlatched and opened. Duty had been a word handed to her by men in black coats. This felt like its truer cousin, choice, well lit. A rap sounded at the shop's street door, courteous, then a shade less so, then impatient. Nathaniel and Eliza exchanged a glance. He set the mock-up's pendulum gently at rest as one settles a child to sleep, and led the way. At the counter stood a man in a constable's coat, clean, official, carrying the scent of damp wool and authority. His beard was trimmed to a short, righteous neatness, and his gaze slid over the shelves as if inventory could be conducted with a glance. "Mr. Harcourt," he said, without greeting. "Good day." "Good day, Constable," Nathaniel answered evenly. "How may I be of service?" "We have had reports," the constable said from the corner of a mouth that did not quite smile, "of certain stolen designs in circulation, valuable, dangerous to common trade. I am empowered to inquire regarding any such objects and to seize them if they appear likely to disturb the peace." "Stolen," Nathaniel repeated. "So I am told," the man said. "Have you received any packages? Any books? Any mechanical drawings from gentlemen lately deceased?" Eliza stood just within the workshop door, out of the constable's direct view. She could feel her heart adopt the eager manners of a mouse, wishing to be small, agile, and very far away. She did not move. Nathaniel's stillness steadied her like a hand. "My business is clocks and watches," he said. "Most of my packages arrive from men complaining of lateness, rather than from mortality." "Permit me to look," the constable said, already angling toward the counter flap. "No," Nathaniel said. "Not loud, not soft." The constable blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "This is a private shop," Nathaniel replied. "You have named no statute. You have a suspicion so general, it is merely a taste. I decline to cook for it." Something in the constable's gaze sharpened, and for a slender instant, Eliza saw behind it, not the dignity of law, but the appetite of a man who enjoys finding his reflection on other men's faces. He leaned his knuckles upon the counter. "You have had visits," he said, "from ladies with generous purses, from gentlemen with deeper ones. A word of caution, Mr. Harcourt. There are doors that open only once. If you will not have them opened for you, they may be opened over you." Nathaniel's expression did not alter. "My doors open when my bell rings," he said. "Good day." A pause in which the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Then the constable straightened, tipped his hat, and left, the bell's civil chime escorting him into the street. Nathaniel lowered his hand from the counter. It shook once briefly, like a tuning fork remembered by a note that has already died. He looked toward the workshop. Eliza met him halfway. "He will return," she said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Men who are certain of their welcome do not knock so loudly." "Then we must be quicker," Eliza replied, "and quieter. And perhaps," she drew breath, "perhaps I must not walk here by the most direct streets, nor always at the same hour, nor always in the same hat," Nathaniel said, with a thread of warmth that did not mock her courage, but sought to show it a mirror. "I have a second door at the back, which opens upon a lane too mean for fashion. Use it when you can." "I will," she said. He hesitated, as if the next words required him to lift a weight that was real only to him. "Miss Whitcomb, Eliza?" He stopped there, surprised by his own use of her given name. He did not repeat it, but the echo of it colored the room. "You may leave the journal here, should you feel safer for it." She shook her head. "Number its place is where my father placed it, under his roof, in his desk, in my keeping. But I will bring what you need, and I will learn what you teach. My father did not raise a courier. He raised a mind." "Then we are equal in our arrogance," Nathaniel said softly, "and I am glad of it." The lamps hissed a little as the oil warmed. Outside, the rain had thinned to a silk that did not fall so much as hover. Eliza put on her gloves. At the threshold to the lane he had mentioned, a narrow passage smelling of wet brick, soot, and old flowers. She paused. "Nathaniel," she said, careful with the name that had just been given back to her, "if I am not at liberty to be bound by an arrangement I did not consent to, I am at liberty to choose those bonds I do wish. For the present, I choose the work, and, if we are careful, I choose to trust you." He inclined his head. He did not thank her, which would have sounded like a bill paid for a favor. He accepted, and the acceptance felt like the proper currency. "Until tomorrow," he said. "Until tomorrow," she answered, and slipped into the lane. London wore evening like an idea it tried on each day and never quite tired of. By the time Eliza reached Devonshire Terrace, the fog had risen again. The house greeted her with its collection of familiar small noises, the settling of stairs, the distant cough of a coal grate, learning its flame, the polite inquiry of a clock on the landing. She took the journal from its drawer, laid it upon the desk, and set her palm upon it, as if taking its temperature. "Father," she said into the quiet, and the word was neither prayer nor complaint, "if what you began was meant to change the arithmetic of men who measure bread with other people's hours, then forgive me that I did not see at once why secrecy was a kindness. I see it now." She opened the book. Between one sketch and the next, a slip of paper winked as if it had waited for precisely this confession. Eliza eased it free. It was an old letter, folded twice, addressed in her father's hand, not to a name, but to a shop. Harcourt and Company. She hesitated, then unfolded it. "My dear boy," it began, and the tenderness of those 4 words brought tears at once to the surface of Eliza's eyes. You will say I am sentimental to write upon paper when we speak in person at least weekly, but some thoughts require ink more than breath. If I die before we prove it, promise me you will not permit them to sell your conscience back to you at a price you cannot afford. I have bound our houses not to trap two children, but to defend one instrument, and I ask forgiveness of them both. Should Eliza quarrel with me, as she should and must listen to her, she has my stubbornness without my vanity. Give the poor man's hour back to him. I believe we can. The letter was not signed. It did not need to be. Eliza folded it again with reverence and tucked it into the journal where her father's last sketches rested. She did not sleep at once. Sleep asked that she hush the mind that had just begun to hum. Instead, she drew fresh papers and copied by lamplight, not 3 pages this time, but 2, cautious and exact. She paused often to listen for steps on the terrace. Twice she rose to shade the lamp when a carriage pulled up outside and the fog was briefly remade in gold. When at last she lay down, the city's breath came in through the window, and with it a conviction as calm as weather, that some secrets were not kept to exclude the undeserving, but to protect the fledgling. The trouble with fledglings is that they must learn to fly before the cat learns to jump. In the morning, she would return by the back lane, a different bonnet upon her head and an ordinary parcel under her arm. The clocks would be waiting, and Nathaniel's careful hands and the ugly, honest contrivance that had already learned to listen. Outside, bells counted the hour. She did not enumerate them. She only let their intervals fold on one another until the sound became a kindness. Chapter 4. The Invention's Purpose. The following morning dawned pale and windless, the fog lying low as though it had settled in for a conversation it meant to finish. Eliza rose early, her fingers already eager for the smooth touch of paper and ink. She dressed in a modest bonnet of dove-gray felt, tied with a ribbon the color of faded lavender. In the hall mirror, she scarcely recognized herself. The bonnet softened the lines of her face and cast a discreet shadow over her eyes. It was a face designed to be passed over without remark, and she found she liked it for precisely that reason. She wrapped the copied pages in a brown paper, sealing them with a wafer. To any casual glance, the package might have been a small box of biscuits for a neighbor, or a stack of bills to be delivered to a tradesman. The journal itself remained at home, locked away beneath the false bottom of her father's desk drawer. The back lane Nathaniel had mentioned was as unlovely as promised. The cobbles were uneven, and the walls on either side seemed to lean inward in silent conspiracy, blocking the sky to a mere ribbon overhead. Eliza's boots found small pools of water from the night's rain, and the air smelled of brick, smoke, and damp straw. She kept her head bowed and her steps steady until the narrow passage opened upon the rear yard of Harcourt and Company. Nathaniel was waiting, the door already unlatched. He stood with the look of a man who had been at work for hours, yet the faint lift of his mouth when he saw her suggested she was an expected part of the day's machinery, as essential as the first winding of a clock. "You found it easily?" he asked. "Easily enough," she said, stepping inside, "though I dare say it would not flatter London in an oil painting. I am not in the habit of entertaining artists back here," Nathaniel replied, securing the door behind her. but it serves. The workshop seemed warmer that morning, as though the ticking of the assembled clocks had taken on a protective air. The mock-up waited under its lamps, its pendulum stilled, its brass gleaming faintly. Nathaniel took the package from her and unwrapped it with the careful efficiency of a man opening a rare watch case. "You've chosen the portion that relates to the secondary train," he observed, scanning her neat copies. "It seemed to me the next logical step," Eliza replied. "If the governor is to answer the pendulum, we must understand the language they speak between them." Nathaniel's eyes lifted to hers, and there was no condescension there, only agreement. Precisely. They set to work, the quiet between them companionable and alert. The secondary train, as Nathaniel explained, was not the primary keeper of time, but its interpreter, translating the pendulum's steady beat into the movements that would ultimately turn the hands. If it was ill-proportioned, the entire device would either rush or dawdle, undermining its own proof. "I see now," Eliza murmured, tracing the lines of her father's sketch with one gloved finger. "This is the portion that could be tampered with most easily in a factory's bell clock. A subtle change here, and the workday becomes half a quarter longer without appearing so. And the laborer's complaint becomes a matter of poor timekeeping rather than theft," Nathaniel said quietly. "Your father designed this to be incorruptible." They adjusted the ratios according to the figures in her copies. Nathaniel's hands were deft, his movements deliberate. Eliza found herself attuning to his rhythm, passing the needed tool at precisely the right moment, without being asked. It was an unspoken language that grew between them, the kind that often arises in a kitchen, a sick room, or any place where two people serve the same purpose with equal heart. By mid-morning, the pendulum was in motion again, the new train engaged. Nathaniel leaned close, listening, not merely to the tick and talk, but to the manner in which they alternated, the way the second wheel answered the first. Eliza watched the faint light catch along the curve of his cheekbone, the patient stillness in his gaze. "It holds," he said at last. "Not perfectly, but enough to know the theory is sound." Eliza smiled, her satisfaction tempered with caution. "Then we must improve it before anyone else knows it exists." Nathaniel inclined his head. "You begin to think like a clockmaker." They paused only briefly for a pot of tea which Nathaniel fetched from the front room. It was strong and a little smoky, poured into mismatched cups. They drank standing at the workbench, their elbows nearly touching, steam rising between them in thin threads. "I thought of your visitor yesterday," Eliza said quietly. "Aurelia Voss," Nathaniel replied, as though naming a season. "She strikes me as a woman unused to refusal," Eliza said. "Entirely unused," Nathaniel agreed, "and entirely persistent." Eliza hesitated, then asked, "Do you trust her?" "No," he said, without heat, "but I know her habits. She will attempt flattery, then offers, then pressure. If those fail, she will wait and try again." "And the constable?" Nathaniel's gaze darkened a shade. "He is less patient. and more dangerous for it. They returned to the work, each turn of the screw and adjustment of the arbor, feeling more urgent. Now that the invention's purpose had been named aloud, the rhythm of their hands and the measured sound of the pendulum were almost hypnotic. Eliza could feel the world beyond the workshop receding, replaced by the immediate necessity of this small, stubborn machine. It was nearly noon when Nathaniel straightened, setting down his tools. "Come," he said. "There is something you should see." He led her to a tall cabinet against the far wall. Unlocking it with a key from his waistcoat, he opened the doors to reveal an array of clock faces, pendulums, and brass gears, each mounted upon boards or frames, in varying states of completion. "These," he said, gesturing to the shelves, "are all attempts at what your father envisioned. Some are mine, some are his. None have succeeded entirely." Eliza stepped closer, studying the differences. Some were delicate, almost decorative. Others were plain and utilitarian. A few appeared overcomplicated, bristling with extra wheels and springs as though trying to make up in effort what they lacked in elegance. "This one," Nathaniel said, pointing to a modest frame with a narrow pendulum, "came nearest. It kept true for nearly 3 weeks before the temperature shift in the workshop slowed it by the smallest fraction. Small enough to pass unnoticed in an ordinary clock, too great for our purposes." Eliza's gaze traveled over the rows. "You've been working at this for years." "Yes," he said simply. "And yet you never told her," Eliza said. "Meaning Aurelia Voss?" "No," Nathaniel replied. "She would have bought the name of it, not the heart." They closed the cabinet and returned to the bench, the air between them quiet but full. Eliza felt the shape of the task settling more firmly in her mind. Not just the mechanics, but the secrecy, the strategy, the understanding that their success depended on both precision and patience. As the afternoon wore on, they refined the adjustments, testing and retesting. Now and then, Nathaniel's hand would brush hers as they reached for the same tool, or his shoulder would almost touch hers as they bent over the diagrams. It was not deliberate, nor was it entirely accidental. Each time, Eliza felt an awareness pass between them, unspoken but warm, like the small heat a candle gives in a dim room. By the time the street lamps outside glowed pale in the fog, the day's work was done. The pendulum swayed in a steady arc, the train moving without complaint. Nathaniel covered the mock-up with a cloth as one might settle a child to sleep. "You've learned quickly," he said. "I have had a patient teacher," Eliza replied. Their eyes met for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Nathaniel's gaze held that mixture of respect and caution that Eliza had seen in her father when he was on the verge of trusting someone with a truly important secret. "Until tomorrow," he said at last. "Until tomorrow," she echoed and slipped once more into the back lane, her heart keeping a time of its own. Chapter 5. The Last Turning. The city woke under a sky the color of pewter. Fog lay low on the pavements, not drifting so much as listening, as though London itself had paused to hear whether a secret might be spoken. Eliza Whitcomb opened the study door and stood a moment in the threshold, taking the temperature of the morning. The house had that particular quiet of anticipation No footsteps upon the stair, no rattle of a cart in the mews, only the smallest breath of coal in the grate and the measured heart of the clock on the landing. Upon the desk, wrapped in oilcloth and swaddled in felt, lay the regulator. She touched the corner of the case with her fingertips. A promise lay inside, made of brass and balance, of patience and proof, of an hour returned to those from whom it had been pinched. It felt at once delicate as a swallow's bone and serious as an oath. There would be no dawdling today. She dressed with care for anonymity, a bonnet in a retiring shade, a cloak neither new nor shabby, and slipped into the street by the back way, the case cradled close. The fog received her as an old aunt might, with a cool kiss and a warning not to tarry. At Harcourt and Company, Nathaniel had already raised the lamps, though the shop remained locked. He opened to her, knock at once. There was a fatigue about his eyes that spoke of a night with more thinking than sleep, and yet the steadiness of him was undiminished. "You came early," he said. "Early feels safer than late," she answered, stepping within. "Is the shop watched?" He inclined his head toward the side window. A figure loitered near the tobacconist before dawn. Bowler hat, a posture that pretends at leisure. I brewed coffee loudly and trimmed a lamp with ceremony. He affected indifference. I affected belief. Eliza set the case upon the counter. "Then we shall behave as ordinary as we can, for as long as we may. When the world peeps through a keyhole, it mistrusts whatever it cannot recognize." Nathaniel's mouth tilted. A sound rule for clocks and conspiracies. They carried the case to the workshop and unwrapped the instrument as one might unwrap a child from winter's shawls. Even at rest, the regulator looked composed, sure of its purpose without vanity. Nathaniel set it upon the center bench and took one careful breath before lifting the pendulum from its cradle. Eliza noted the ritual of his motions, the unspoken prayer contained in a craftsman's composure. "We do not dare test it today in the window," he said softly, "but we must confirm its temper after the journey." "Do you think it sulks when moved?" she asked, allowing herself the gentlest of smiles. "Only as any delicate truth does," he said, not smiling, and set the pendulum into motion. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The beat filled the room like a kindness. Eliza felt the sound settle along her nerves in the manner of a lullaby offered to an alert child, soothing without dismissal, firm without severity. Nathaniel bent to the plates with the loop. She watched the second train answer, and the small governor offer its indulgence, then its correction, in the exact measure her father had calculated. The instrument did not sulk. It remembered itself. "Good," Nathaniel said, in a tone that seemed to warm the brass. "It holds." They let it run a while, the better to be certain, and during that, well, they said little. Some companionship asks for conversation. Some companionship is conversation enough. Presently, Nathaniel straightened, removed the loop, and looked not at the regulator, but at Eliza. "Today," he said, "we must decide to whom we lend our proof, not to those who would buy and bury." Eliza said at once, "Not to Aurelia Voss, who relishes patronage as a synonym for possession. Not to Inspector Garrow, Nathaniel added, who speaks as if the law were a ladder for his boot and not a rail for the common foot. Then to whom? Eliza asked, though she had been walking toward the answer all night in her thoughts. A court? A paper? A guild? Nathaniel's gaze moved to the door that led to the shop front, as if he could see straight through it to Fleet Street's presses. A paper might catch the ear of a morning. A court might stiffen a spine for a week. But we require a constancy not easily brined away by talk. Eliza lifted her chin, then to the printers. He returned his attention to her. Say more. To the men whose wages are counted by the whisker of a minute hand, she said. To the compositors who set in, lead the words other men wield against them. To those who listen to bells and suspect they are rung by fingers that love profit too well. She thought of Pearl in the little museum, of the patient stories watched over by glass, and to those who remember. Nathaniel was silent, considering. Then he nodded once. The Printers' Guild meets this evening in the hall behind Salt and Ink. They argue wages on Wednesdays and drink forgiveness on Thursdays. We shall bring a truth worth arguing today. Before Eliza could answer, the front bell chimed with a briskness that did not belong to any of their friends. Nathaniel lowered the workshop lamps 1 degree and smoothed the cloth over the instrument with that careful economy that hides without lying. He met Eliza's eye, wait, and stepped into the shop. Mr. Harcourt, came a voice like velvet drawn over a box of needles. So fortunate that you are open to your old friends. Aurelia, Nathaniel said, perfectly courteous. Eliza remained behind the door, the slit of sight between hinges, offering her a thin theater of silhouettes. Aurelia Voss had come not with sables, but with certainty, the kind more costly than fur. Beside her stood a gentleman, whose coat fitted him like a habit. Inspector Garrow, smelling of damp wool and rightness. A third figure lingered, hat in hand, the deferential shadow of a secretary. I have brought a small problem for you to mend, Aurelia said, lightly, withdrawing a watch from her reticule, and a larger one, which you may mend by saying yes. Say yes to what? Nathaniel asked, not moving from behind the counter. To a commission worth more than your humble shop sees in a year, she said, as if counting the coins for him would be an indecency. A factory regulator for Spitalfields, an instrument to keep honest time over honest work. The city is growing. Order must grow with it. Garrow set 2 knuckles upon the counter, a pose he fancied showed patience. And I am here, he added, to satisfy myself that no stolen designs pass through this establishment. Rumors do fly. Rumors are notoriously poor navigators, Nathaniel replied. They often mistake weather for destination. Charming, Aurelia murmured. Say yes, Mr. Harcourt. It will be so much tidier for everyone. Nathaniel's hands rested easy upon the edge of the counter. No. Silence made a small, satisfied sound. Garrow's mouth thinned. You decline a patroness of the city in the presence of the law, I decline a purchase that would harm those who could not afford to refuse it, Nathaniel said. As to the law, if it requires a search, it may fetch a warrant. Aurelia examined her glove as if it had offered an opinion. Warrants are such tiresome theater. Must we be so formal, Mr. Harcourt? I truly dislike unpleasantness. Formality, Nathaniel said, is a poor man's armor. I am fond of it. Garrow leaned an elbow as if confiding a recipe. We hear you have been visited by certain manuscripts. We hear you have been seen with certain airs. Eliza felt her pulse mark the seconds. She stood perfectly still, as a page does just before the reader turns it. They are mistaken, Nathaniel said mildly. Or lying, Garrow returned, with a cheerfulness that sounded like a threat in a different coat. If I were convinced of either, I would be obliged to sort the matter at source. Aurelia slipped her watch back into its nest. What my friend means is that we need not be at odds. One does not buy the sea, Mr. Harcourt. One merely requests its tide at a convenient hour. You may keep your romance with your conscience, if romance it is. Give me the instrument, and I will, how do the sentimental put it, do the most good for the greatest number. Eliza had reached her measure. She stepped into the doorway, not forward enough to be conceded as audience, not backward enough to be missed. You have miscounted the good, she said evenly, as those who do not work by other men's bells often do. Aurelia turned with an expression of genuine delight, as if a tête-à-tête had become a salon. Miss Whitcomb, how perfect. We have met in column inches, but not in person. How sorry I am for your loss. You are not sorry, Eliza said, without heat. You are only practiced. Which is a kind of charity, Aurelia returned, not offended. One carries the right words, ready for the right moment. Shall we carry, too, the right solution? You and Mr. Harcourt may marry tomorrow if you like. I will send flowers. Give me the device, and I will see it used to lift the city. Lifted like a coin from a pocket, Nathaniel said, and Aurelia's eyes flashed the faintest pearl of humor at being so neatly answered. Garrow adjusted his cuff. Miss Whitcomb, if you are in possession of papers belonging to your late father's estate, and if those papers were obtained improperly by any party here present, it would be in your interest to assist me. Eliza let the weight of her father's letter steady her, the single folded page that had named her stubbornness and asked its use. Inspector, you will have the courtesy to request a warrant. You will have the patience to wait as long as the law requires. And you will have the disappointment of discovering that I am not so easily shepherded by a gentleman's urgency. Aurelia looked amused. Garrow did not. The bell chimed again, this time with the modesty of someone entering a chapel to see if it is occupied. Pearl, the museum's docent, with her lemon drops and her memory for footnotes, stepped inside. Behind her came the proprietor of Salt and Ink, his ink-stained fingers betraying a morning's labor, and two printers, with dusting of graphite upon their cuffs. Not a crowd, not a mob, simply witnesses of the right sort. Pardon, Pearl said, as if she had not noticed the temperature of the room. Mr. Harcourt, Miss Whitcomb, Are we still for this evening's demonstration in the back hall? I brought the pendulum you loaned the museum, the long one with the bob like a bishop's egg. It speaks plainly even to untrained ears. Aurelia's gaze flicked to Garrow, and Garrow's to Nathaniel, whose expression had not altered, though Eliza felt the smallest, precise relief move through him like a gear finding its tooth. It was no accident that Pearl had come just now. The city, too, had friends. Indeed, Nathaniel said. This evening will do. Splendid, Pearl replied, and offered Aurelia a lemon drop from the blue dish in her reticule, with the same courtesy she offered to children. For the nerves, dear. Aurelia accepted it, as a queen accepts a daisy, not because she requires it, but because it would be less interesting to refuse. We shall see one another again, Mr. Harcourt, she said, turning. Some doors open only once. It would be a pity if you missed this one. Good day, Aurelia, Nathaniel said, with a gentleness that had no room left in it for persuasion. Garrow lingered the length of a breath. I shall have my warrant, he said softly, and we shall have a look. Bring both, Nathaniel replied. We shall have tea. When the door closed, the shop shed a layer of its weight, like a man putting down a valise he had pretended was light. Pearl did not remark upon the visitors. She merely patted Eliza's hand as one reassures a niece after a thunderclap. Evening, she said again, as if writing it on a slate. Bring the thing that tells the truth, and we will lend it ears that know how to keep a story when they hear one. They prepared as careful thieves might prepare to return an object to its rightful owner. The regulator would not go through the front. It would go wrapped and plain through the back, in the arms of a printer whose gait did not promise value. Eliza would walk not by Fleet Street, but by a longer road that doubled back on itself, the better to learn whether the bowler hat had grown curious about her bonnet. Nathaniel would follow last, locking behind him what could be locked, and trusting the clocks to keep their counsel. Do not be foolishly brave, Nathaniel said, as he fastened the case. Be sensibly brave, Eliza returned, and he nearly smiled. At the threshold of the back lane, he paused the way a man does, whose tools are in order, and whose heart would like to be. Eliza, he said, the name careful and plain, if the arrangement our fathers inked, were the only bridge the world offered us, I would burn it, rather than march you across. If, however, you would choose to walk any bridge with me, I will spend the rest of my days building good ones. Her answer rose as naturally as breath. There is no contract stronger than a choice made in daylight, she said, and I am willing to choose when choosing becomes a kindness and not an order. Then let us finish the work that makes choosing honest, he said, and that was courtship enough for the hour. The hall behind Salt and Ink had the look all useful rooms share: scuffed floorboards, stout chairs, a dais that was a crate before it was a platform. Lamps hung from iron hooks. The air smelled of paper, ink, tea, and talk. Men and women came in their work coats and Sunday shawls. A vicar in a mended cuff stood near a table of mugs. A magistrate, not presently on duty, occupied a corner chair with the expression of a man who knows the letter of the law and hopes today to overhear its spirit. Pearl presided with kindly tyranny. We will not argue until we have listened, she announced. We will not applaud until the pendulum is at rest. We will not interrupt the tick with the talk. Nathaniel set the regulator upon the table at the front. He did not unveil it with ceremony. He unwrapped it as a baker unwraps bread. Eliza stood beside him. The printers who had carried the case took places behind them like a second back wall. Hands easy but ready. Ladies and gentlemen, Nathaniel began, his voice carrying not by force, but by clarity. This is only a clock. It will not stretch your day. It will not shorten your life. It will not make you wiser than you are. But it will keep time in a way that answers to bodies as well as bells, to temperature as well as temper, and to proof as well as persuasion. He set the pendulum into motion. The room exhaled. There is a correctness that can be heard even by those who do not know its mathematics. The beat took up space in the chest as much as in the ear. Eliza lifted her father's copies. These figures, she said, are not spells. They merely keep a cruel arithmetic from disguising itself as discipline. With this instrument, we can compare the hour that a factory claims to keep with the hour that a body feels in its pulse and the hour that the street keeps by the sun. If a foreman's watch runs long by a sliver each morning and short by a sliver each night, this will say so. A hand went up, ink-stained. Who says your clock is more honest than theirs? Nathaniel nodded at the question, as if it had been a courtesy. Because its temper does not alter with heat and cold, as common brass does, for the bearing stones hold it steady. Because its governor allows indulgence and correction in a measure that keeps greed from pecking at the seconds. And because we will keep it in the museum, down the lane where any man may come, to compare his watch without paying for the privilege. A murmur, approval, curiosity, the cautious welcome London gives to anything new that smells like fairness. The vicar raised a hand, and if a magistrate wished to hear the truth without hearing only a gentleman's version of it, Pearl tapped the table with a lemon drop. He would come here, she said cheerfully, or we would bring it there. Eliza felt a steadiness flower within her that had nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with belonging. Nathaniel adjusted the beat the width of a hair. The room listened. Outside, a carriage passed and was forgotten. Inside, an hour began to feel like itself again. Neither a burden nor a bargain, simply a measure. A figure appeared at the back, hat in hand, Inspector Garrow, warrant folded between fingers, the way a knife is concealed in a napkin. He took in the scene, the hall, the crowd, the magistrate off duty, the vicar on his feet, the museum's friend, the printers, the instrument, and understood that the door he meant to open over another man would not swing inward for him tonight. He advanced as far as the threshold. You exhibit stolen property, he announced with a formality that sounded borrowed. No, Pearl said, before anyone else could speak, we exhibit public sense. The off-duty magistrate rose. Inspector, he said mildly, you are very welcome to listen. If you intend to seize, you must name the statute. If you intend to threaten, you must fetch another audience. Garrow's eyes measured the room. He folded the warrant and slipped it away, either to be used another day or to be forgotten according to whether his pride would permit its memory. Mind your minutes, he said softly to Nathaniel and turned. We will, Nathaniel replied, "now that they are ours." The demonstration did not end in applause. It ended in the quiet that hardens into decision. Men whose mouths had been prepared for argument found themselves nodding instead. A woman who kept accounts for a mill filled 2 pages with figures and then closed her book with the expression of someone who has been given a lantern for a path she already knew by heart. The vicar asked for the regulator on Sundays after service. The printers promised a column that ink could not soften. Pearl collected names in her precise hand, the better to organize appointments at the museum. When the room had emptied to the ghost of talk that all good rooms hold, Nathaniel replaced the pendulum in its cradle. Eliza tied the cloth. They stood a moment, looking at the thing they had brought into the light. "It should not live in my workshop," Nathaniel said, "nor in your desk. It should live where anyone may ask it a question." "In the museum," Eliza answered, and touched the case with her palm. Under Pearl's eye, under a glass that keeps dust off and puts greed on notice. "Then that is where it shall live," he said. They walked back together along the lane that offered fewer eyes and more puddles. Fog lifted and sank as if breathing along with them. Fleet Street's lamps wore halos. Somewhere a boy whistled a tune he did not know the name of and would never forget. At the door of Harcourt and Company, Nathaniel paused with the key in his hand and did not turn it. "Eliza," he said. The fog had a way of making first names sound like vows. "We have returned an hour to its owner. Will you permit me to ask for the rest of my life as a fair exchange?" She felt laughter rise with tears, neither riotous, both sincere. "Only if the life is offered freely," she said. "Only if the hour is ours without ledger. Only if the choice is not borrowed from a father's ink." "It is freely," he said. "It is ours, and it is mine to give." "Then I accept," she said, and the word felt like a door that opens inward upon a room already furnished for comfort. He did not kiss her there in Fleet Street's eye. He bowed as a gentleman bows when the moment is bigger than his mouth. She curtsied not to his name, but to the care with which he held it. Their hands touched, and that was tenderness enough for a night that had asked so much of courage. They married not at once, but soon. Soon in the human sense, which is to say, when grief had folded into memory, and work had learned how to go on being work, even while happiness lit the room. The arrangement their fathers had sketched upon paper was acknowledged and set aside, like a coat one is fond of for its history and not for its fit. Invitations were penned. A modest church in a quiet square received their vows. Pearl brought lemon drops in a blue dish and insisted they were appropriate to all sacraments. The printers stood in their clean shirts and blinked when the vicar spoke of love as a labor rightly paid. Aurelia Voss sent flowers, extravagant and correct, accompanied by a note that managed to congratulate and to warn, without smudging either with sentiment. Inspector Garrow did not attend. He had found another door to rattle. The regulator lived behind glass at the museum, and men who might have been frightened by the apparatus if it had been preached at them came instead to hear its beat and to ask it small, brave questions about their own days. At Harcourt and Company, clocks continued to keep their 1,000 private promises. The long case, with its open hood, gained a new serenity, as if relieved to find that precision might be loyal to kindness, and not only to habit. A silver pocket watch sat upon the shelf, with the single engraved letter that Nathaniel had once called his failure. One afternoon he took it down, opened the back, and replaced a wheel that had always sulked with one that had finally been taught how to sing. He closed the case and listened. It kept time at last, not perfectly, but with a humility that made perfection seem less urgent. Eliza's father's journal remained in her desk, not hidden now, but honored, its letters less a commandment than a conversation. Some evenings she read one of his notes aloud to the room, and Nathaniel answered the parts that invited engineering, while she answered the parts that asked for heart. They did not argue over which answer counted. They counted the hours instead, not to hoard them, but to notice where they went. In due course, the city learned what it always learns when a thing is both new and right, to make a place for it. Where once a foreman's watch might have shaved a sliver of a morning, a boy with a pencil now made a mark in a margin and looked up to see whether the museum's regulator agreed. It often did. When it did not, men looked at one another not as conspirators do, but as neighbors, and somebody fetched Pearl, who fetched the magistrate, who fetched the tone that keeps the city from fraying entirely. Eliza and Nathaniel walked in the evenings when the fog was gentle and the shop was content to mind itself. They spoke of the small things that fatten a day, bread from the corner, a cat who believed itself a philosopher, a melody a boy had whistled, that turned to larger things when held in two pairs of hands. They learned the sound of one another's silences and the minute declarations hidden in each other's habits. They discovered that love, like a good regulator, indulges and corrects, and that its purpose is not to make days, long or short, but to let them be truthful. And when, after such a walk, Nathaniel wound the clocks and Eliza doused the lamps, the shop settled itself with the satisfied creak of wood that has done right by its weight. The last sound to remain was the pendulum in the long case, keeping company with the dark tick-tock. Two tiny courtesies, traded back and forth across the night. Some secrets they came to understand are not meant to hide things, but to keep them safe until the hour is kind. Some promises are not meant to bind, but to free, once spoken with the right tongue and heard by the right ear. And some loves are not arranged by fathers or defended by ledgers. They are chosen in the clear by two people who have learned the difference between duty that shrinks the day and devotion that enlarges it. So the last turning was not of a key nor of a gear, but of two hearts toward one another. And in that motion, time, stubborn, merciful time, kept its beat and gave them back their hour, which is all any clock can do for those who truly listen. Thank you for listening to Moonlit Romantic. In the quiet workshop of Claremont Square, the clockmaker learned that love cannot be wound or measured. It arrives in its own time, and once found, it marks every moment after. If the clockmaker's bride touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who believes love is worth the wait. Until we meet again, sleep softly, dream deeply, and remember, The truest timepieces are the hearts that beat together